You may think that creating a good black and white photo is as simple as coming to the black and white conversion and getting your software to remove the colour. But if you want to create a black and white photo that has more emotional connection with your viewer, then there's more to it than that. And that's exactly what I'll be covering in this video. Now, while the concepts of working with black and white that I'm sharing here are universal, some of the tools that I'll be using here only exist inside of Luminar AI. If you use Lightroom, Photoshop or another editor, you'll be able to follow along with around 80% of this edit, but for the more creative side of things, I'm going to be using some tools which are specific to Luminar. If you want to get yourself a copy of Luminar AI, it's already a really affordable photo editor, but I've also got a discount code which is @Sky10 and you can use that at the checkout to save yourself some money. But for the rest of the video, I'm going to assume you've got Luminar AI, so let's get into the edit. Here's a photo shoot that I did with my daughter around the house just the other day, and if you haven't seen the behind the scenes video of that, I'll put a link to that in the top corner of this video. Here's the photo we're going to work on today, and the first thing we'll look at is the settings I used to capture this. I shot this with my 70 to 200mm lens. I'm at ISO 64, which is natively the lowest camera sensitivity that I can go to. So we'll be getting a really nice clean file that is pretty noise free. I'm at the shallowest depth of field that this lens has, which is f2.8. So we can see that my daughter's eyes here, which is the point where I focused, are nice and sharp, and we're already falling off into blur as soon as we hit her shoulder. And by the back of the bedroom here, which is only probably about a meter away from where she's positioned. So if you are shooting portraits, a nice shallow depth of field is really beneficial because we want our attention to be on our model, not the background. But even so, it's still quite busy just based on the pattern on her duvet here. So I'm going to see what I can do in post-production just to kind of dull that down so our attention isn't drawn to all of that pattern. My shutter speed here is 1,000th of a second, but as long as I'm able to handhold the camera without getting any motion blur from me wobbling, I'm happy. I don't care what that figure is. Okay, let's get to editing this. I often recommend that the first thing you do is jump into the Enhance AI tab here and just crank the Accent AI slider up just to see what Luminar's suggesting for you. And this one AI tool is just insanely powerful. It's so useful. If we look at our before and I slide that back up, you can see that it's correcting the exposure. I underexposed this photo. I wanted to make sure that I retained highlight detail here in the dress and in her face. So it was slightly underexposed from what the camera meter was telling me. So I know I've got all that lovely detail there, and Luminar is smart enough to know that I underexposed this photo and it's actually correcting that for me. I like what the Enhance AI is doing to my daughter, but it's bringing too much attention to that background. So what we're going to do is use the local masking feature here, and we're just going to paint this in. So as soon as I click, it gets rid of the effect everywhere apart from where I'm going to be painting this red. So I'm just going to go all the way over my daughter here, and we've got a nice soft edged brush, and once I let go, we can see that we've got that effect that we applied before only affecting my daughter. But because we have a soft edged brush, we are getting a slight halo where that's bleeding over her head here. So if that happens, what you can do is just come back to the erase tool and just take the effect away from the offending areas. The part where her hip is here and also the duvet behind, I don't want our attention going here either. So I'm just going to remove that sort of brightening Enhance AI effect from there. Let's just paint it back in just a little bit here. And if you want to, you can just sort of toggle between the two. So let's have a look at our before and after with that tool. Here's before, underexposed. Pop that effect on and we're in a much better place, I feel. Okay, because we want to create a black and white, there's probably not too much point continuing along the path using a color version of this. So what we're going to do is jump straight to the black and white tool here and click to convert to black and white. And now we've had all the color ripped away from the image and we're left just with a black and white version. And usually when you do desaturate a color image, the initial black and white conversion is pretty flat, pretty dull and pretty lifeless. And that is exactly what we've got going on here. And because we've stepped into a visual realm that is purely based on luminosity, i.e. the brightness, areas of contrast start to catch our eye a lot more. And so in the color version, when I felt like straight away we were starting to get this sense of this is where we want to look, the brightest part here, and everything else was just fading back. As soon as we've changed to black and white, the emphasis that was on my daughter here is kind of gone, it's kind of lost. So through the editing process, we want to bring back the emphasis on my daughter and make this busy background just recede a little more. So within the black and white panel here, we have access to actually control the brightness of each of the colors that existed in our color photo. And that's one of the reasons why you always want to shoot in colour. Even if your end product is supposed to be black and white, shoot in colour, and then you can control these colour channels individually. Because her skin tones exist in the kind of orange spectrum, I'm going to push up both the red and the yellow channels here. Judging the brightness values within a black and white does take a little bit of practice, but one trick that I think works quite nicely is when you're just starting out, it's a good idea, just blur your eyes. So just gaze at the photo in front of us, blur our eyes, and straight away by blurring our eyes we can see that this is definitely the brightest area, which is what we want because our eye naturally goes to the brightest part of the image. But we do have a couple of problem areas, and that would be her legs down here. That is also catching our eye, as is the duvet here. But in my opinion, the biggest problem area is this square we have here, where the sunlight is coming through the window, hitting the wall here, and we have this bright square here. If you're learning something from this video or just enjoying the edit in general, please do me a favour and just click that thumbs up button below. It really helps my channel out. And if you do want to go a step further, leave me a comment below and consider subscribing if you haven't already. The next thing I want to do is jump into the Structure AI tool, and I'm going to crank it all the way to 100 just so I can get a sense of what this tool can do for us. Now, as you'll see, all of a sudden the background suddenly becomes a lot more punchy again. And this is definitely something we don't want for this particular photo, but I do want to make you aware of this tool and what it can do for the localized contrast that is there in your photo. Let's suppose you're dealing with a landscape, some street photography. There might be a lot of areas of detail that you just want to enhance in your black and white, and this Structure AI tool is a fantastic way to do that. You'll also notice that it doesn't affect our model as much as it does the background, and there's a reason for that. You rarely want to create a high contrast look on someone's skin. When you do a portrait of someone, they want to look good, and if you start messing with their skin, making it really high contrast, they're not going to be very grateful for it. So the AI inside of Luminar is smart enough to mask out the person here and say, no, we're going to limit the amount of the structure that we add in to the skin area. But if I flick between the on and off, you'll see that there is still some that's added, and one thing that I really like is it's actually enhancing the brightness of the shadow areas here, and that's actually helping to create a three-dimensional form on my daughter. So again, I'm going to leverage the fact that we can use a mask and just paint this in only where I want it. There we go. Let's toggle our before and our after. I can see that we also have a little bit of bounce light on her leg here coming off of the dress, and that again is just helping to give a bit of three-dimensionality. So what I may do is just paint in a little bit of that structure. Oh, I'm on 100%, so that's a little heavy. But if I toggle this off and then put it back on again, you'll see that we are actually increasing those bright areas, and that's helping to show that the leg is rounded. I've got my histogram visible here, and that's telling me that I have a large distribution of dark tones in this photo and not so much in the midtones and hardly anything in the highlights and very brightest parts. To have a full tonal range, we would want this part of this graph here to actually be touching the right hand side here. And it's a long way from doing that. So what that's telling me is our brightest parts of the photo, so her dress here on her chest and the highlights in the hair here, they're not pure white. They should be, especially in a black and white. We want to maximize the tonal range from black through to white. So the best way to do that is to jump into the light section here. And now if I expand the blacks and whites, we have access to actually grab the white point and start lifting that up. As I move it to the right and we see our white point actually get brighter, that's great, but you'll notice that the histogram itself isn't updating. It only updates when I release the slider. So what I recommend doing when you're making these fine adjustments is to move the slider and then let go. And what you're looking for is the very top end of this histogram graph to just start hitting the white point. If I push this all the way to 100, which isn't what we want, but you'll see that we have a big spike here on the right, and that's just saying that the brightest part of our photo is now hitting that very white point, and that's bleaching it out. And you can actually see that on her dress here. We've now hit pure white right here, and we're losing all detail, which we don't want to do. So we want to bring this back to the point where we're just starting to hit white, but we're not losing detail. I think that's pretty good. Let's zoom out. Now let's do the same for the blacks. We're pretty close, but I'm going to bring it down a little further. And if you want a visual warning to let you know when you are clipping either the blacks or the whites and pushing them too far, just click on the little triangle here, and straight away you get a warning to say whether or not the pixels shown here are pure black or not. So if I lift the blacks up, you'll see that most of those blue warnings are gone, and if I push it to the left, we're smashing down so much of this file into those blacks. And potentially, if you want a super high contrast image, that may be a creative decision that you actually want to do. But personally, I like to see detail in the shadows, so I'm just going to lift this up until we're only getting blacks in the very deepest of shadows, and I like to get a balance between getting a nice rich black while at the same time not losing details. So I'm fine that that's pure black in these particular areas, and already we've come a long way in this black and white edit from the flat washed out desaturated version that we started with. There's 3 more things I want to do in the editing process with this photo. One is I want to work with local masks to try and dull back the area around my daughter. I then want to jump into the creative section of Luminar AI just to see if I can enhance things, maybe with the dramatic tool, maybe with a little bit of softening or a little light glow. And then the final thing I'm going to do is just visit curves just so I can refine the look of the contrast. So let's jump into the local masking. We're going to add a local mask. So the goal with our local mask is just to drop the background, the periphery around our model back so it's not as contrasty, it's not grabbing our attention as much. So one way to do that is just to darken it down. We can drop the highlights, we can boost up the shadows so we're not pushing completely to black. And whereas Structure AI actually enhanced the contrast in those areas, what I'm going to do is actually reduce Structure AI. -100 is far too much, but maybe we just want to tease that in at around sort of -28. Yeah, I'll go a little further. Now I can grab the contrast slider as well and just reduce that. And now I have the option just to bring the exposure down just a little bit further again. And now you can see that overall we have a much flatter, more sort of mid-grey image right the way across here. And I'm able just to use the paintbrush tool just to paint this in around Amelia. So this is with it off, this is with it on. And now using the concept of how we can control specific areas of the photo, what we could do is actually create another local mask, which is actually going to help to enhance and add details into our model, maybe even brighten up certain areas. So let's do that. We'll add another basic mask, and this time we're going to boost the exposure up. Let's lift the shadows, and this time maybe increase the contrast. So again, I'm going to grab my paintbrush. I might reduce the opacity ever so slightly because that allows me just to build it up in those layers, and I can do it a little bit more refined this time. And let's go again with another pass of this. And I think I want to make more of a feature of the flowers and her hands as well. So I'm going to add one more local mask. I'm going to boost the exposure. I'm going to add some contrast. And I'm going to bring the highlights down just so I'm protecting those very bright areas on her dress showing through here. And by lifting the shadows up, we're going to see more detail in her hands here. And this time I'm going to paint it in, but much more accurately, just over the flowers and just over her hands as well. If you do a lot of painting with masks, what I would recommend you do is you actually treat yourself to a graphics tablet, and that is going to help you paint this in much more accurately. Currently I'm doing this with a mouse, and it's pretty difficult to be as precise as I would like. I'll put a link in the description below for the graphics tablet that I use, and I've had a few different brands and also different sizes over the years, and this is what I consider to be like the sweet spot. So certainly check that out if you want to be freed from making painting strokes with a mouse, which is what I'm doing right now. Let's have a quick glance at our before and our after just to check on the direction we're going with this photo. Now let's jump back into the editing section and let's see what we can do with the creative tools. I don't think that this tool is going to work well for this particular black and white because it's going to be adding drama, and I want this to be more of a soft, subtle kind of edit. But I do quite like what it's doing. The flowers, particularly if I turn this off and then turn it on, it's just enhancing the details of the flowers. So I may just mask this in actually. And this is one of the reasons that I really like Luminar, because it's really easy just to play with different effects. And sometimes by putting a tool on and just seeing what it looks like, you can be surprised and see possibilities that you just didn't even think of before. Now, one other thing you can do is actually work with the mood section here, and you can actually add a LUT. And that would normally manipulate the colors within your photo. But we're dealing with a black and white, so surely this isn't even going to work. Well, what you can do, if I scroll over here, you will actually see that we can actually control the contrast in the image in specific ways by using the lookup tables. So we could go for a washed out 1960s look here, and this is kind of the direction I was hoping to take the photograph anyway. We can have something much more contrasty. And if we look at the difference between the color punch cold and the colour punch hot, there's not too much of a difference in it, but that subtle tweak might be exactly what you're looking for. Because I want something quite soft and tender, I'm going to go with this 1960s, and among other things, that's lifting my black point up, so I don't actually have a pure black anymore, but I have a deep grey. But because I took care in my initial edit to make sure I had a pure black and a pure white point, now by adding this mood look, even though we're lifting that black point up, we've still got a really nice amount of contrast in this, but now it's treated in a much more subtle and soft way. So let me just toggle this off and toggle it on. And I like that, and so it's really worth bearing in mind that the mood tool can actually be used to manipulate and enhance your black and whites. If you do want to add a little bit of colour to a black and white, come to the toning section, and here you're able to add colours to the shadows and the highlights. So you may choose to just add some colour into the shadows, or you may choose to do both. And if I am changing both the shadows and the highlight colours, what I like to do is work with a complementary colour scheme. So I might go towards the blue tones for the shadows, and then when I'm coming into the highlights, I'm going to crank the saturation up, and then I'm going to choose a more orangey yellow hue. If you don't have Luminar AI yet and you think this would be a good bit of photo editing software for you, I do have a discount code which is @Sky10, and if you use the link below, that also helps me out because I get a very small commission from Skylum as well. And so now we've got a subtle toning to our image. So let's toggle this off, and you see the pure black and white, and now I'll toggle it on and you can see that toned version. Of course, if you think it's too much, you can pull that amount down, or if you want a little bit more of it and you want it more intense, you can crank it up. For this particular portrait, I want something quite soft and tender, and so I feel that adding a bit of a glow would really benefit this photo. So I could come into the mystical section and have a little play around with this. So if I crank that all the way to 100, and you can see that we've got a nice glow going on. As is often the case, 100% is far too much, but it's good to push the tools all the way to their maximum just to see exactly what they're doing to your photo, and then it's easier to see how much of the effect you want to dial back in. If I come to the glow section, we've also got a lot of options here. We've got our soft focus, glow, and the autumn effect. The autumn effect was popularized for adding glows to landscape photography, but of course you're not limited just to using it on landscapes. We can use it for a portrait if we want. At 100%, everything's bleached out, and that's obviously not what we want. If I come to the autumn effect soft, this is helping to enhance that more tender feel that I want to this photograph, but again, it's far too much, so we're just going to grab that amount slider, take it to 0, push it back to 100, and then with a little wiggle back and forth, we can kind of get this dialed into a place where we're happy with it. I'm quite pleased with how things are looking, but if you want to dial things in even more precisely for your contrast and ultimately a black and white photo is just a visual description of the contrast in your photo. So we can jump into the light section, and the really powerful curves tool is hidden within the light section. And if you want to know more about how to use this rather daunting looking tool, in my most recent video I actually cover this in depth, explaining exactly how to use this. So I'm already happy with how we've adjusted the black point, but if I want to, I can actually lift these blacks even further. But in terms of contrast, I could just click, put a point in the middle of the graph, and I can either pull down to create a more contrasty look, and that might be quite nice, or I can push this up to boost the midtones. In this case, I think I'm just going to pull it down just ever so slightly, and then just bring the shadows up just a tidge. I have no idea what sort of measurement a tidge is, but I've just boosted that up just a little bit. And as my very final step, I'm just going to do a little bit of edge patrol. And what that means is I'm looking around the edge of the frame of the photograph for anything distracting that catches my eye. So for example, here in the bottom right hand corner, this little dark triangle that we've got going on here, I find that quite distracting. So I've got a couple of options. I can either crop that out, or I could use, say, the clone tool just to copy a bit of this duvet cover and replace that there. But other than that, I'm pretty happy. So I'm just going to do a quick crop. So I'm going to come to the composition AI tool and just pull this into where I want it. And I'm sure you will have heard of the rule of thirds before, but basically if we can put areas of interest falling on these third lines, and in particular the intersections where the vertical and horizontal thirds meet each other, the rule of thirds tells us that our viewers will find the photograph more engaging. Now, while it is called the rule of thirds, I'd say use it merely as a guide. There's many more options that we have at our disposal for good composition as photographers, but the rule of thirds is a good one to get started with. So we'll go with that and just close this down. And there we have it, a nice tender black and white conversion from this original colour photo, which was underexposed and had a very distracting pattern on the duvet, to this version, which I find much more endearing. It's very soft and tender, which harmonises with the overall mood of this photograph. But I think as a more interesting comparison, let's take a look at the original black and white conversion that Luminar did for us, and now compare that to what we created with a little bit more refinement and control. So when you're working with black and whites, I'd recommend you keep these points in mind. A basic black and white conversion is merely the absence of colour, and it's never going to be very impactful. Work with the contrast that exists in your scene. Enhance the areas that you want people to look at. Use Luminar's tools to help guide your viewers' eyes and the areas that as a photographer you're saying, this is important, look here. And the flip side of that is use the tools available to you just to dull back and reduce the contrast in the areas where you don't want people to look. So I encourage you to go and grab one of your favourite photographs and dive into Luminar's editing tools and see what you can create. Thank you so much for watching, guys. I'll catch you in the next video.